if you're thinking of changing your garden or even just a corner of your garden, here are some ideas that I really like that I've picked up from shows and private gardens I've visited recently. It's Alexandra here from the Middlesized Garden YouTube channel and blog. And if you research Change Your Garden on the internet, you'll get lots of good ideas. But very often they won't tell you whether those ideas will work for your garden. They won't give you the pros and cons. So that's what I'm also going to do here. So where do you start with changing your garden? Well, even if it's just one corner or one bit that you want to change, I would strongly recommend going back to basics and making a list of everything you want your garden to be or to have. And of course, your lifestyle may have changed since you last did anything in the garden. Children may have left home, or you may have new children, or you may have pets, or you may no longer have pets. And there may be parts of the garden, like dead zones, where you actually don't really use at all. When I interviewed award-winning garden designer Pollyanna Wilkinson on how to design a garden, she said the first thing you should do is take a screenshot of your garden from Google Earth so that you actually see its shape, because so few gardens are actually rectangular or square. They're usually kind of slightly irregular shapes. And she said, then measure it. And award-winning garden designer Kate Gould says that once you've measured your garden, you should measure it again, because it's so important to get the measurements right. And that is, the smaller the garden, the more important it is, because if you're going to have any built-in features or anything like expensive paving, you don't want to be a couple of feet or a couple of metres out. The next thing to do is to consider where the dead zones are. There's often a dead zone along the side of someone's house. You know, it's like a passageway going from the front to the back. And it's very shady and there's not much you can do there. But actually, look at some ideas and you'll find that there is probably. You'll often be advised, if you're thinking of changing your garden, to create garden zones. And this is good advice. It's pretty much standard garden design advice, because certainly in a middle-sized garden or a larger garden, you can have your herbaceous border, you have your veg patch, you'll have your dining and seating areas, you might have a sort of woodland, a shady area you can turn into a little woodland garden, and so on. But the smaller your garden is, the less create garden zones works. I interviewed Frances Tophill, the BBC Gardener's World presenter, on her book, A Year in a Small Garden. And she says that one of the things you need in a small garden is not to create zones. It does get too cluttered. So everything needs to be as multifunctional as possible. Now, this can mean, putting storage under seating, or it can mean having fruit, vegetables and flowers all in the same borders. And certainly in the garden shows recently, I've seen a lot of gardens where you've got flowers, vegetable, fruit, and maybe even chickens, and the eating and dining area all in one. And that looks really great. Make the most of your budget. The fact of the matter is that no matter how many thrifty tips and hacks that you find, doing some things in the garden is going to cost. And the most important thing is the labour cost. So I think it's important to be realistic about this. And once again, this is a bit of advice from Frances Tophill, who says economise on everything except for the one thing you really want. And for her, this was to have a greenhouse built of recycled doors and windows. Now, if you're an expert amateur DIY person, rather like the person I interviewed for this greenhouse, you could do all this yourself and it would be a really cheap way of doing a greenhouse. However, for Frances, it took 4 days for them to build the greenhouse, and 4 days' labour means that it wasn't much of a saving on buying an off-the-peg greenhouse. But it was still right for her because it's not creating anything new. It was using recycled things, so it's a more sustainable greenhouse. And it also reminds her of the Gardener's World Live show garden that she did, which had a recycled greenhouse made of doors and windows. And she'd always said, if I ever have a garden of my own, I want one of those. I think one of the best ways that you can change your garden easily is by creating a new seating area. A new seating area gives you a different view of the garden, and it can also act as a focal point. Liz Philpott, who is in these English country gardens I featured in a video I'll put in the description below, has, for example, broken up a large expanse of sloping lawn by putting a seating area about halfway down. It's actually near a pond, so it means that she and her husband can enjoy a drink in the evening and look at the wildlife on the pond. But also, if you look at the garden, it's really broken it up in a really lovely way. And similarly, Richard and Leslie had a long border that people tended to sort of walk past, and they turned it into something that people walked to by putting in an octagonal deck with 4 chairs, a table and a colourful parasol, and it's now become one of their favourite places in the garden. Of course, the main thing to think about with seating is the garden furniture, because garden furniture will not last so long if you don't have somewhere to store it in the winter. But of course, if you want to use your seating area as a focal point, you don't want to put it away in winter. You may not have the storage to put garden furniture away in winter. We don't. And of course, you may not want great big bulky tarpaulins on top of it protecting it for 5 months of the year, because winter does seem to last rather a long time. So choose garden furniture in the materials that last best, which is definitely stone, metal and plastic. Properly treated hardwoods will last longer than softwoods, and the rattan or rattan style, even when they're treated to last outside, won't last as long as any of the others, but they'll still last years. Add pots and planters is another piece of advice you will be given about how to make your garden look nice. And pots and planters are great because they add an instant pop of colour, and also you can pretty much put that pop of colour literally whenever you want it, wherever you want it. So if things are looking a bit dull, you can fill your planters with something you've literally just bought from the garden centre. For example, you might have lots of bulbs in pots like Dan Cooper does here in this garden of his. And of course, when those pots go over, the bulbs die out, he can replace it with something else. However, if you're thinking about pots and planters, you need to know that it's not low maintenance. So this goes back to what you want your garden to be and what you want your garden to have, because you might want lots of colour and you might want it to be low maintenance, and you are not going to get that from pots and planters, because everything, including food and water, comes from you. If you plant a plant in the ground, then it will often be sorted by rain, particularly if you've chosen the right sort of plants for your area. But in a pot, you may have to water small pots every day in the summer. Larger pots are easier to look after, but of course they're more expensive. So that is just something to think about with pots and planters. The other advantage of pots and planters, of course, is that you can take them when you move if you're renting, like this amazing rented garden by Shaun Mooney. And he did actually move out of it, but he did say those pots and planters filled up a whole van. Add a water feature or a pond. That's another thing you can do to change your garden, and almost all of the show gardens had some sort of a pond in them last year. Ponds are the best thing you can do for wildlife, and they're also a great focal point, and there's something for you to sit by and watch. Obviously, it's a bit more of a problem if you're in a mosquito-prone country where mosquitoes carry dangerous diseases, in which case you will have to take specialist advice. But in many places, such as the UK, adding a pond to your garden shouldn't be a problem in terms of mosquitoes. Mosquitoes, by the way, live in stagnant water and they live in shallow water. So provided your pond is more than 12 inches deep, and if you can keep it moving, for example, with a pump, then you shouldn't encourage mosquitoes. But ponds are much easier to look after than water features. The more elaborate the water feature, the more likely it is to go wrong at some point. That's what garden designers tell me. But if you get the balance of plants right for ponds, they're very easy to look after. You'll need some oxygenating plants, and that's basically freshwater seaweed, and that will be under the water and you won't really notice it. You'll probably need some plants that are marginal plants. They're plants that grow in very shallow water. They often flower and they'll attract bumblebees and other pollinators. You'll need some plants that sort of stick up straight out of the water, almost like reeds, because some insect larvae need those in order to emerge from the water, such as dragonflies. And then you'll need what you call landing pad plants, which is things like water lilies, and their leaves sit shallowly in the water, which means that insects can drink from these little shallow mini ponds at the top of the water. If you can have some sort of a beach, that's hugely helpful. If you've got a raised bed pond, try and make sure that wildlife can get into it and out of it, which means building it up with something like bricks inside and perhaps having pots or something around it outside so that things can get in and out safely. And also, it's very important to make sure that toddlers and babies can't access ponds. Then there's adding a pergola or an arch or a gazebo, and this is a lovely way of adding height to a garden. And it means you can grow climbers up it, and it really makes a beautiful focal point. The thing to remember about pergolas, gazebos and arches is that because they're high, they are more affected by the weather. So they do need to be very firmly placed in the ground. You may have to concrete in the posts, you may have to put a concrete platform, or you may have to use really strong iron spikes, but they have to be secured. You can't just stick an arch or a pergola on top of a lawn, for example. The other thing that can happen if it's just stuck on top of the lawn is that it will sink a bit, and then the unevenness of it will make the pergola fall apart. And then there's choosing the climbers to go on it. If you choose climbers that all have different pruning times, then it may be difficult to get to one climber because you'd have to cut away another. The other thing is, don't get a climber that gets too big because it'll act as a sail. Not only will you be cutting it back all the time, but if you don't get to cut it back and there's a high wind, it'll take the pergola off with it. I've got a video on how to choose climbing plants that I'll put in the description below. And then there's add raised beds. Well, raised beds are fantastic. They started in the vegetable garden so that people could grow vegetables without standing on the soil. And they have now migrated. You can get raised bed ponds, you can get raised bed herbaceous borders, you can get vintage raised beds, you can get contemporary raised beds. They're a really big part of garden design, and they are particularly good for small gardens because they raise the height of the flowers and the planting. So you can sit there feeling as if you're surrounded by the colour and the plants. But once again, raised beds aren't for everyone. Firstly, they're expensive. You need to get the soil right in them. You should use a mix of garden soil, topsoil, and something like garden compost or well-rotted manure. If you just buy bags of garden topsoil from your local supplier, not only will it cost you a lot of money, but the RHS advise against filling a raised bed just with bought topsoil. They say it is better to mix it with your own garden soil. And because they're raised, water always goes down. So raised beds will drain more quickly than ordinary borders. And if you live in a place where you regularly have droughts or it's generally dry, you may find raised beds don't really work for you. Then there's change your garden with colour. A pot of paint can transform your garden. You can paint fences, pots, furniture and even pavers, and you can use paint to pull the garden together. Garden designer Paul Bangay has a very large garden and it's divided up into lots of different garden rooms with different styles. But it's all pulled together by using one simple, beautiful blue paint on the garden furniture and the gates and the uprights and the pergolas and all sorts of things. So that is a very good tip to think about. Use a good quality exterior paint and prepare the surface properly, and don't paint in a very hot day or very windy day because it'll affect how the paint will dry. And if you want more inspiration on how to change your garden, then don't miss this video coming up next, which is a Design Your Garden from Scratch garden design compilation. And thank you for watching. Goodbye.